In the summer of 1943, Soviet armored commanders began filing reports that German intelligence officers initially refused to believe. The accounts arrived from separate sectors along a vast stretch of the Eastern Front, each describing the same phenomenon. A Junkers Ju-87 Stuka executing dive attacks at angles and altitudes that violated every documented principle of Luftwaffe ground attack doctrine. Witnesses described a dive profile steeper than 70 degrees, bombs released below 200 meters, and pullouts initiated so late the aircraft seemed to skim the earth before clawing back into the sky. At first, Soviet after-action assessments treated the descriptions as stress exaggeration, the distortion that happens when men watch vehicles explode and then search for an explanation that fits the scale of their fear. But the reports kept coming. Tank crews who survived described the same silhouette, the same markings, and the same unnatural geometry of attack. Soviet radio chatter began referencing the aircraft with a kind of superstitious dread, as if it operated outside the rules governing other machines. On the German side, Luftwaffe command reviewed early intelligence summaries with skepticism bordering on irritation. Stuka pilots were trained, their procedures were refined through years of combat, but they were not magicians. The aircraft itself was aging and its vulnerabilities were well known to Soviet gunners who had learned to track the predictable rhythm of its attacks. If one pilot was achieving unusual results, it was more likely luck or Soviet error than some radical departure from doctrine. Then the gun camera footage arrived. A Bf-109 escort pilot, flying cover near Oral, captured only seconds of film showing the Stuka beginning its dive. The angle was immediately wrong. Standard doctrine called for roughly 60 degrees, a balance between accuracy and survivability, and what the human body could endure during recovery. This aircraft entered at what analysts estimated was around 75 degrees, nearly vertical. It should have ended in a high-speed impact or a structural failure in the pullout. The footage showed neither. The Stuka released its bombs in a blur, then wrenched skyward in a recovery so violent the camera lost it for frames. When the escort's lens found it again, the aircraft was climbing at full throttle, trailing thin exhaust smoke but otherwise intact. Below, a column of T-34 tanks disappeared under stacked pillars of smoke and debris. Technical officers, flight instructors and veteran Stuka pilots reviewed the film frame by frame. None could explain how the maneuver was executed without killing the pilot or breaking the aircraft. The G-forces should have induced blackout. The airframe stresses should have torn something apart. And yet the evidence was undeniable. Someone had found a way to make the impossible routine. The markings identified the aircraft as part of a Schlachtgeschwader ground attack unit operating in the southern sector. The pilot's identity remained strangely thin in official records, referenced through mission logs and aircraft codes rather than a celebrated name, yet the legend spread anyway, among both Luftwaffe ground crews and Soviet intelligence officers. By 1943, the Eastern Front was a machine that devoured predictability. Terrain was an endless steppe broken by river valleys and scattered villages, with roads choked by armor and supply convoys. Weather turned violence into an endurance contest. Summer heat to autumn mud that swallowed vehicles, then winter cold that froze oil in engines and skin to metal. Most important, Soviet anti-aircraft density had grown exponentially since 1941. Quad-mounted machine guns, 37mm autocannons, and heavier flak batteries turned the airspace above armored columns into a lethal zone measured in fractions of seconds. For Stuka pilots, the equation became grimly simple. Attack from safer altitude and achieve little, or press closer and accept near certain death. In that context, a pilot who flew suicidal profiles and returned alive was not merely brave, he was a tactical problem no one could solve. German command wanted the technique copied. Soviet command wanted the aircraft destroyed. And somewhere inside the daily chaos, the pilot kept flying missions that defied explanation, leaving behind wreckage, scattered reports, and the growing sense that war had created something outside the boundaries of what professionals considered possible. Why the maneuver should not have worked. Dive bombing as a concept emerged in the 1930s and was refined in earlier campaigns. The Stuka became the defining embodiment, an aircraft designed to deliver bombs with near-surgical accuracy. But it was built around a controlled profile, a steep dive, yes, yet steep within limits. Standard Stuka doctrine called for an attack initiated from altitude, typically 3,000 to 4,000 meters. The pilot rolled into a dive around 60 degrees, using dive brakes to stabilize the aircraft and limit speed. Bomb release occurred higher than most people imagine, often around 600 to 800 meters, followed immediately by recovery. Pulling out demanded 4 to 5 gs, enough to gray out vision and threaten consciousness, but still within what trained pilots could manage. The margin for error was thin but calculable. Too early and accuracy suffered. Too late and the aircraft hit the ground or the pilot blacked out, losing control. The Stuka had an automatic pull-out system for emergencies, but relying on it was considered a last resort, a sign something had already gone wrong. By 1943, the Eastern Front made that carefully balanced geometry a liability. Soviet gunners learned the Stuka's rhythm. They anticipated the aircraft's most vulnerable moment, when it was committed to the attack run, stabilized by brakes and temporarily predictable. Losses climbed. Entire squadrons were reduced in weeks. The aircraft itself was aging, outclassed by newer fighters and increasingly vulnerable to ground fire. Luftwaffe command debated whether the Stuka was simply obsolete, but the need for close air support remained and replacements were insufficient. Schlachtgeschwader units carried the burden. The formation tied to the impossible pilot had transferred from Crimea earlier in 1943 and redeployed toward the Kursk sector. Its roster showed the strain, veterans with hundreds of sorties alongside replacements with fewer than 20. Ground crews cannibalized damaged aircraft. Spare parts dwindled. Fuel tightened. Mission tempo rose. In such conditions, innovation didn't arrive via doctrine. It emerged from desperation. A veteran pilot could survive only by adapting to the evolving kill zone. Steeper dives reduced the time exposed to tracking fire. Lower release altitude increased blast and fragmentation effect. Later pullouts compressed the entire attack into seconds. Less time for gunners to correct aim. Each adjustment flirted with death. But continuing to fly the correct profile increasingly meant dying in a textbook manner. Prokhorovka, July 12, 1943, the 14 tanks. July 12, 1943. The southern sector near Prokhorovka, part of the violent pulse of the Kursk battle. Scattered clouds sat low, visibility was good, and the temperature rose fast toward midday heat. The 3rd Guards Tank Brigade, part of the 5th Guards Tank Army, was redeploying through a river valley. The column's strength was estimated at dozens of vehicles, mostly T-34s with supporting infantry and trucks. The formation moved with spacing to reduce vulnerability, turrets scanning continuously. Soviet doctrine had adapted. Flak vehicles were integrated into armored movement. Quad-mounted heavy machine guns and 37mm autocannons were positioned to saturate the air at the first sight of aircraft. For Stuka pilots, those guns were not background noise, they were the rules of the environment. The Stuka pilot received scramble orders at 9:17. He lifted off with 3 other aircraft from a forward strip within range. The loadout was typical: 250 kilograms bombs under the wings, enough fuel for roughly 90 minutes, and a briefing stripped down to essentials. Hit the column, disrupt the advance by time for German ground forces. At 9:43 the flight leader sighted the target by its dust plume. The approach used cloud cover and angle to delay detection. Standard tactics called for sequential dives, each aircraft peeling off, diving, releasing, recovering, then regrouping. The first Stuka rolled in around 9:46. Dive brakes deployed. Soviet gunners opened fire immediately. The first bomb landed close enough to damage one tank but not destroy it. The second Stuka dove slightly lower and achieved one confirmed kill, but took hits that punched through the wing. Then the third aircraft rolled into its dive, and the geometry was wrong. The roll was sharper, the nose dropped past 70 degrees toward near vertical. Dive brakes did not deploy. Airspeed climbed rapidly. Soviet gunners tracking the descent struggled to adjust. The aircraft dropped through their firing solutions faster than human reaction time could keep pace. Standard profiles offered seconds of tracking opportunity. This offered less. At an altitude later estimated by witnesses as under 200 meters, the Stuka released its ordnance. Both bombs in a near-simultaneous pattern over the densest point of the column. Then the recovery began. The pullout was so late it looked like impact was inevitable. The aircraft's trajectory bent from near vertical toward horizontal in a tight arc, wingtips seeming to brush the valley walls. The pilot would have been hit by crushing G-forces, enough to tunnel vision to gray, to shove blood from the brain, to turn decision-making into a fight against blackout. If he lost consciousness for even a second, the aircraft would hit the ground. The bombs detonated in overlapping sequence across an elongated kill zone. The valley amplified destruction. Slopes reflected shockwaves and channeled the blast into the packed vehicles. Tanks at the center were destroyed outright, turrets displaced, ammunition igniting into secondary explosions. Vehicles on the edge were shredded by fragmentation and overpressure, their crews killed or incapacitated. Smoke swallowed the entire formation. The full attack sequence, from dive initiation to impact, lasted only seconds. By the time Soviet gunners reacquired the aircraft, it was climbing at full throttle, trailing exhaust as the engine was pushed beyond limits. The remaining Stukas attacked using standard profiles with only minor additional effect. The flight regrouped and turned west. Reconnaissance later confirmed 14 tanks destroyed or disabled, with additional vehicles damaged and the column's movement halted for the day. Soviet reports noted the unusual effectiveness but explained it in safer language. Luck, terrain, concentrated target density. German logs recorded it with bureaucratic terseness. Target engaged, significant damage inflicted, aircraft returned. The pilot's own report, filed later, read like numbers without narrative. Dive angle around 75 degrees, release altitude around 180 meters, recovery begun around 120, estimated 7 to 8 gs, Airframe stress noted, inspection recommended. No explanation of why it worked. No indication of fear. Just the suggestion that the impossible was now routine. Why others couldn't copy it. Within days, other Stuka pilots tried to replicate the profile. One initiated a steep dive but pulled out early, training and instinct overriding intention when the ground rushed up too fast. He scored a couple kills, respectable but not extraordinary. Another pressed lower and improved results, but took heavy damage and rode off his aircraft in an emergency landing. A third matched the low altitude and misjudged pull-out timing by a fraction. His aircraft struck the ground and disintegrated. No survivors. After that, the attempts faded. Not from a formal ban, but from quiet recognition. One exceptional pilot achieving extreme results did not justify average pilots dying to imitate him. The maneuver resisted systematization because it required what cannot be standardized: reaction time and spatial processing at the edge of human capability. Aircraft differences also mattered. The Stuka in question had accumulated enormous combat time. Field repairs and battle damage introduced asymmetries. A veteran pilot learns those quirks until the airframe becomes an extension of his nervous system. Another aircraft, even the same model, would respond differently enough to make the same maneuver unreliable. Terrain compounded the problem. The Prokhorovka engagement happened in a valley that amplified blast and constrained the Soviet column. In open steppe, the same bombs might scatter damage rather than concentrate it. In other words, the maneuver was not simply a trick. It was a convergence of pilot, machine, and geography. Soviet intelligence began tracking the aircraft more aggressively. Fighters were briefed to intercept it. Anti-aircraft units were told to prioritize it. Ammunition allocations increased where it was seen. Yet even as Soviet attention focused, the broader strategic picture made the pilot's impact increasingly irrelevant. One pilot could destroy tanks, but the Red Army could replace them quickly. The Luftwaffe could not replace fuel, parts, or experienced crews at the same pace. The pilot continued flying, but the war's scale swallowed individual excellence. Winter 1943-44. Attrition closes the window. Winter brought fuel shortages that collapsed sortie rates. Ground crews scavenged wrecks for parts, improvising repairs beyond any manual. The Stuka showed fatigue, skin panels rippled, oil consumption rose, controls loosened subtly. In early 1944 the aircraft was grounded for weeks waiting for parts that never arrived. The pilot flew substitute aircraft, identical on paper but alien in feel, and the impossible profile became too risky without intimate familiarity. When the aircraft returned to service, patched together with scavenged components, the operational environment had shifted. Soviet air defenses layered more densely, overlapping kill zones from quad machine guns to 37mm autocannons. Approach vectors became crossfire traps. Soviet fighters patrolled in greater numbers. Engagement windows shortened. Precision became approximation. The pilot still achieved extraordinary results when conditions aligned, but those conditions became rare. Meanwhile, squadron attrition continued. Veterans vanished. Replacements arrived undertrained, lasting only a handful of sorties. Death became administrative, an empty space in formation, a name removed from the roster. By spring 1944, Soviet intelligence still tracked him, but the intensity faded. There were larger objectives now: breakthroughs, encirclements, frontlines collapsing westward. Tiraspol, April 3, 1944. Capture. On April 3, 1944 mission. Logs recorded a routine ground support sortie near Tiraspol in poor weather, low cloud, intermittent rain, reduced visibility. The pilot executed a standard dive and released ordnance on a Soviet infantry concentration. During recovery, climbing through cloud base, anti-aircraft fire struck the aircraft from a battery the flight had not detected. Shells tore through the engine area, severing lines and controls. The Stuka began spinning, uncontrollable. At low altitude the pilot bailed out, parachute deploying barely in time. He landed behind Soviet lines and was captured within minutes. Transported to higher headquarters, he was interrogated. He gave the minimum required: name, rank, unit. When questioned about the unusual dive profile, his answers turned into technical generalities: physics, trade-offs, combat necessity, accurate enough to sound cooperative, useless enough to prevent replication. Within weeks he was moved into the larger prisoner system. His tactical knowledge, never written, never taught, died the moment he was removed from the cockpit. The aircraft, abandoned as the front moved, was destroyed later in the retreat. The archives, evidence without explanation. Soviet archives preserve fragments, after-action reports describing attacks executed at unusual angles and altitudes, patterns of damage inconsistent with standard doctrine, analysts noting a recurring anomaly tied to a particular aircraft. Countermeasures were suggested: denser flak patterns, revised formations, fighter interception priorities, but no systematic counter-doctrine emerged because the underlying mechanics were never fully understood. German records that might have documented the maneuver were scattered or destroyed in the war's final months. Gun camera footage survived only in fragments, showing seconds of abnormal dive geometry without the internal human reality, the split-second judgment, the edge of blackout control, the intimate knowledge of one battered airframe. The contradiction remains. The Stuka specifications are known, human tolerance is known, the physics are well modeled, yet the maneuver was executed repeatedly. The best explanation is also the least satisfying. It was not a transferable technique. It existed in the intersection of a single pilot's neurology, a single airframe's quirks, and moments of terrain and target density that could not be guaranteed. Remove any part of that triangle and the impossible becomes impossible again. The 14 tanks remain a verified outcome, documented across enemy records and witness reports. The method that achieved it remains unsolved, because war produces knowledge that cannot always be written down. Sometimes the only proof of a solution is the wreckage it leaves behind.